would be a left-leaning administration that would believe in tax policy as a type of redistribution of income. Okay, and to certain ways they do. Okay, Gordon Brown, who's the Chancellor of the Exchequer under Brown, does some good things like introduce tax credit for working families and for married people, but they reduce the lowest rate of tax to 10%, but that is only for those people on an income of less than £7,500, about $10,000. Okay, but it's an important thing, and then they reduce the other rates to 20% for those who earn less than £37,000, and 40% for those who earn over £37,000, and then 50%, the new top rate of tax for those who earn over £150,000 a year. Okay, now the consequence of this has been a really dramatic growth in income inequality, which is mapped on this graph here. And this is the Thatcher administration, the Major administration, and the so-called Blair-Brown administration. The important point is basically that it's all heading, the graph is all heading in the same direction. The average income in Britain remains about £25,000 a year. 80% of the population now earn less than £35,000 a year. That's about $50,000. And 90% earn less than £42,000 a year. That's about $60,000. Over 13 million families are living on less than £15,000 a year. Okay, so the vast majority of Britons continue to live in a pretty precarious position, either as in a precarious position that doesn't look that dissimilar to the position of the working class in the first half of the 20th century. I could go on about what's happened to the 1%, but I think you get the. I'll give you one figure to demonstrate that. If you take the ratio of a CEO to their average employee, in 1999 the CEO was earning 47 times more than their average employee. In 2009, they were earning 128 times what their employee was earning. Okay, so public expenditure was the last of these points that I was going to press home to you. And there are a couple of elements that I want to emphasize here. In fact, public expenditure continues to grow throughout the 1980s and the 1990s. So what we're talking about is not cuts as in a reduction of the level of public expenditure. No government reduces public expenditure, but a redirection of where public expenditure is going. And critically, I'm going to suggest to you that what happens in terms of this redirection was an attempt to reform the so-called welfare professionals. Remember how I kept saying to you the welfare state was a technocratic thing, not a demotic thing, and how Thatcher would pick up on that critique? Well, this is how she does it. She basically introduces a whole new series of sort of market systems in public services that sought to take the autonomy away from the professional groups that had dominated the welfare state. Doctors, teachers, firemen, policemen, etc., etc. There are three ways in which this happens, and this continues into the Blair era. The first is that you try and provide competition with private providers. Okay, so you try and introduce private providers to drive down or to increase the efficiency of the public sector. So a good example of that was, for instance, the reform of mail delivery, so that the Royal Mail then had to compete with, parcel companies like UPS and all those other companies, or that the prison service had to begin to compete with private security companies who would be given responsible for the transportation of prisoners, or, just as in the 1950s, broadcasting. The BBC would now have to compete with an increasing array of new broadcasters, first Channel 4, and then, of course, the satellite and digital broadcasting that came in the 90s. So that's the first way, bring in private providers. The second way is to introduce a so-called audit culture. Okay? This is the way in which, for instance, and I'll give you the example of schools here, or universities. Let's use universities because it's more familiar to us all. Universities in Britain are now ranked from the early 90s, basically, late 80s, early 90s, are ranked in league tables according to the quality of their research and the quality of their teaching. Every department is ranked and given a score, so that you, as the consumers of those degrees and that education, can decide which department and which campus you want to go to because of the score that they've got in terms of the quality of their teaching and their research. So this is a way of not privatizing yet, because they don't do that until a couple of years ago. They're not privatizing universities. They're providing ways of auditing and measuring the quality of the services, so that the users of those public services are seen as consumers who can make strategic choices between them. Okay? And the obvious consequence of that is that universities then have to compete increasingly hard against each other. The last example is they introduce forms of internal markets. So, for instance, this happens in the National Health Service, and they can't privatize National Health, so what they do is provide all these types of internal market systems in which doctors are now given the powers to choose between different types of services and different types of hospitals. So again, it all remains in the public sector, but that public sector is divided up into different types of markets and systems. I won't talk about the Citizens' Charter because I'm going to run out of time otherwise. The last part of this is the increasing use of debt financing for the public sector. Okay? So in Britain, that first takes the form of the Private Finance Initiative, which was introduced in '92 by John Major, Mrs. Thatcher's successor. And what it does is enables the government to raise private funds to engage in public infrastructure projects, so that the state itself is not drawing upon its own tax revenues, but is drawing on private loans that were then repaid over subsequent generations. Okay? So basically what it is borrowing money. It's mortgaging the future. It's borrowing money to say, okay, we're going to build new schools and new hospitals, new roads, and we're not going to pay for it now. We'll pay for it further down the line because we don't quite want to do the things that we have to do. That is, tell the electorate that you have to pay more taxes if you want a better school or a better hospital. Private Finance Initiative was used big time by the new Labour administration. This was the way in which they transformed the public infrastructure of the UK. More hospitals, more schools, more roads were built under New Labour than had been built in the 1940s and 1950s. It really genuinely did transform the public infrastructure, but it did it in this sort of mortgaging system. Another great illustration of this is, of course, the privatisation of universities in the UK, which is now entirely dependent upon student loans. And the debt financing is now placed onto the student body, as it is in North America, as opposed to the taxpayer. The logic being, in your case, that it's you that will benefit from your education, not the public at large. So, the philosophy which we all live in right now is that what it is that you learn in your degree benefits only you. Okay? You will not enrich society or the public in any type of way, and therefore you should pay for it, no one else, because it's your benefit. Okay. Let's do another revolution in government. And these last two parts of the lecture are going to rattle by in comparison. I made the point at the beginning that basically this program of the marketization of all areas of social and political and economic life was only made possible by the fact that you had an actually very centralized and pretty strong state in the UK. Okay? And that was necessary in order to introduce the reforms of privatization and economic liberalization. If you think of it in comparison to the US, where you have this federal structure, the central state is in many ways much, much more constrained in terms of what it can do. If you think of it in the US comparison, you never had the public ownership really of sectors of the economy in the same type of way. So the fact that the state owned so much of economic production in the UK, and because it was so centralized, meant that it could introduce these reforms with much greater facility and ease. What I'm going to talk about now is basically the ways in which you see an increasingly assertive and strong centralized state. And I'm going to do it under these four headings of presidentialism, centralization, remoralizing Britain, and then at the so-called end of politics. She's great at photo ops, isn't she? Apparently her advisors were so disappointed that she had to wear the protective goggles because it really sort of undid the sort of alarmingly macho thing of riding on a tank. You know when someone's serious about running for office when they step into a tank or go and visit troops somewhere. Anyway, the key political shift that we see in the 1980s and the 1990s is a new type of prime minister. A new type of prime minister who is now much less invested in the idea of cabinet government, of collective government, and much, much more concerned with projecting their own individual power rather as an American presidential person would. And Mrs. Thatcher provides a key break here. Because, as I said at the beginning, she wanted to distance herself from consensus management, of collective consensual types of government, and instead project herself as a conviction politician who basically did what she thought was right. And this was one of the ways in which this term, this nickname of her as the Iron Lady became apparent, because she was thought to have a will of iron and was determined to stay the course and to not be challenged. Now, one of the ways in which she did that was to continually create enemies within, i.e. people that she was at war with. In a way, the Thatcher administration was about creating a perpetual state of emergency where you were never quite sure where the next villain was going to appear. So the first thing were the dreadful lame ducks of nationalised industries. Then there was the IRA with the hunger strikes in 1981. Then there was the Arges and the Falkland